Dr. Sarah Chen's hands trembled as she held the silicon wafer up to the fluorescent lights of Lab 7. After 30 years at Apex Technologies, she knew every molecular structure in their semiconductor line. But this morning, the chips were doing something impossible. They were rearranging themselves. "Pull the data from Roswell archive," she whispered to her assistant, Marcus. "Authorization, Channel 9." Marcus's eyes widened. Everyone at Apex knew about the Roswell archive, but accessing it meant crossing a line few dared approach. The company's entire empire, the quantum processors, the metamaterials, the breakthrough in room temperature superconductors, all of it traced back to documents sealed in 1947. The archive appeared on her screen. Grainy photographs of twisted metal, symbols that hurt to look at directly, and technical diagrams that seemed to shift when you weren't focusing on them. Her grandfather had been one of the original research team, recruited straight from MIT to a desert facility that didn't officially exist. He died young, his mind fractured by secrets he could never share. "Sarah," Marcus breathed, pointing at his monitor. "It's not just our chips. Reports coming in from Tokyo, Munich, Silicon Valley. Every tech company that licenses our architecture is experiencing the same thing." Her phone erupted with calls. Pentagon, NSA, the quiet men in suits who'd visited once a year since she'd taken over her grandfather's work. But Sarah ignored them all, mesmerized by the pattern emerging on her screen. The chips weren't malfunctioning. They were communicating. "They're here," she said softly. Marcus looked at her like she'd lost her mind. "Who's here?" Before she could answer, every screen in the building went dark. Then, in perfect synchronization, they all displayed the same message in a language that looked like mathematics, having a conversation with music. "Property retrieved. Lease expired. Thank you for your stewardship." Outside, the sky began to change. Across the world, people looked up from their smartphones, devices that had become extensions of their bodies, and watched as the atmosphere itself seemed to pixelate. It wasn't frightening, not at first. It was beautiful, like the aurora borealis had learned to paint in colors that didn't have names. In Beijing, the stealth aircraft that had made China a military superpower began dissolving, their metamaterial coatings simply ceasing to exist. In Moscow, the fiber optic networks that carried the world's data started glowing with an ethereal light. In Washington, the Joint Chiefs of Staff watched in horror as their most classified weapon systems displayed error messages in that same impossible script. Sarah stepped outside Apex Technologies and found herself face to face with them. They weren't little green men or gray beings with black eyes. They were geometry made flesh, if geometry could breathe and laugh and regard you with something like fondness. 3 of them stood in the parking lot, surrounded by what looked like floating equations, solving themselves in midair. One moved forward. When it spoke, Sarah heard it in her mind rather than her ears, and somehow it sounded apologetic. "We didn't mean to leave it here so long," it said. "Our vessel crashed on your world during what you call 1947. We were young then, inexperienced with dimensional navigation. By the time we could return, we found something unexpected." Sarah found her voice. "You're taking it all back. Everything we built." "Not everything," another being interjected, and Sarah sensed amusement. "You kept the knowledge, the understanding. That was always yours. We're simply collecting the borrowed tools." Around the world, the technology began to deconstruct. But it wasn't violent or catastrophic. Smartphones gently stopped working, their users feeling suddenly naked without them. Military installations found their weapon systems reduced to inert metal. Communication satellites blinked out one by one. Yet everywhere, something remained. In laboratories, scientists discovered they still understood the principles. In universities, the equations still worked. The knowledge hadn't been stolen. It had been earned through decades of reverse engineering, of human ingenuity building upon an accidental gift. "Why now?" Sarah asked. "Why after 78 years?" The being tilted in a way that suggested a head shake. "We didn't realize how quickly you would adapt it, how completely you would integrate it into your civilization. We thought it would take you centuries to understand even the basics. Instead, you built an entire world around it in less than a single generation. A fourth being materialized, older somehow, its geometric patterns more complex. There's also this, others know now. Others who would not be as generous about you possessing technology you haven't yet evolved to protect. We remove it not as punishment, but as protection. You're not ready for the attention it brings. Sarah thought of her grandfather, his brilliant mind broken by secrets. She thought of the military contractors who'd made fortunes from technology they didn't understand. She thought of the dependency they'd all developed, humanity chained to devices, to systems, to a technological infrastructure built on borrowed dreams. What happens now, she asked, the eldest being pulsed with something like warmth. Now you rebuild. But this time it will be yours. Truly yours. Slower, perhaps. More difficult. But authentic. And when you reach the same level again, through your own efforts, your own creativity will be watching. And will be ready to meet you as equals, not as children playing with their parents' tools. Around the world, the lights went out. Not all at once, but in a cascade that rippled across continents. In Tokyo, engineers already gathered to discuss mechanical alternatives. In Munich, physicists pulled out old textbooks on vacuum tubes and transistors. In Silicon Valley, programmers stared at blank screens and remembered there was a time before smartphones, before the internet, before instant connection. It would be hard. Millions would struggle without GPS, without instant communication, without the conveniences they'd taken for granted. There would be chaos and confusion and loss. But there would also be something else. As Sarah watched the beings dissolve back into mathematical impossibility, she felt it. A strange sense of relief. The weight of her grandfather's secrets lifted. The burden of stewarding technology they'd never quite understood, finally removed. Her phone in her pocket was now just a piece of glass and metal. But her mind, her human, brilliant, stubborn mind, still held everything she'd learned. She turned to Marcus, who stood pale and shaken beside her. "Call everyone in," she said. "Everyone who worked on the quantum project. Tell them to bring their notebooks. Not their computers. Those won't work anymore. Their actual, physical notebooks." "Sarah, without the base technology, we'll figure it out," she interrupted, and she was smiling now. "That's what we do. That's what humans have always done. We'll figure it out ourselves this time." Above them, the sky was returning to normal. The impossible colors faded, leaving only stars and moonlight and the vast, patient darkness of space. Somewhere up there, Sarah knew, they were watching, waiting to see what humanity would do next, waiting to see if they could climb back up the ladder, this time on their own terms, at their own pace, earning every rung. She took one last look at her dead phone, then dropped it in the recycling bin by the door. "Come on," she said. "We have work to do." Behind her, Apex Technologies stood dark and silent, just one of millions of buildings around the world facing the same sudden darkness. But inside, Sarah could already hear it, the sound of people gathering, of voices discussing possibilities, of human beings doing what they'd always done best. They were adapting. They were beginning again. And this time, whatever they built would be completely, undeniably, triumphantly theirs.